So this is my first summer in a new home with a new garden. And for that reason, I decided to keep my gardening ambitions on the modest side this summer and just planted a few tomatoes, which have been doing quite nicely, thank you, and are laden with fruit that just in the last few days has begun to ripen. And that was the point at which I discovered that the ground squirrels who inhabit my property in great profusion decided that those ripe tomatoes are for them. So this has left me with a certain moral dilemma. And my father-in-law, from whom we purchased property, left behind certain things for me, one of which is a high-velocity air rifle. So I spent some time this weekend learning how to use that sucker. But I have not been able to bring myself to wield it. And I have to also point out that my father-in-law, when he told me about it, said, and the only way I'm ever going to actually hit one of those squirrels is if it runs in front of the pellet. But he also left behind some very cleverly devised little traps, these kind of wire cages that a squirrel can go into by pushing up this little hinged sort of gate, and then the gate drops down again once the squirrel is inside and it can't figure out how to get out. So I have taken to placing one of those in the tomato bed and baiting it with half-eaten ripe tomatoes. Seems like a kind of poetic justice. And in the last few days, I have successfully trapped 3 ground squirrels. But rather than tossing the entire cage with the squirrel in it into the irrigation ditch, as my father-in-law used to do, I have been deporting the squirrels. Put the trap and the squirrel in the back of my car, and I drive a few minutes down to the parking area for the Frisbee golf course at Quinton Lake, and I open up the hatch and wish the squirrel good luck. And see it run off to fend for itself, and I pray that its homing instinct is not so finely tuned that it will find its way back to my tomato patch. Now, this manner of treating the squirrels you could call humane, I suppose. And I've been reflecting a little bit on this word humane as I've been carrying out my campaign against the squirrels. Obviously, it's semantically related to the word human. And to use it in this way implies that to be a human being is to be characterized by a certain willingness to forgive, to show kindness, to take it easy on others, even those who may be a nuisance to us, to go out of our way not to inflict unnecessary suffering on those with whom we share the world. And would that were all there was to human nature? That to be human meant to be humane. But as we all know, there's another side to the picture. Which is why our epistle reading today goes to such lengths to make the contrast between that aspect of our nature that gets angry. Not that there's anything wrong with being angry. It's a perfectly normal human response to having our boundaries transgressed, to being disrespected, or having someone do something to us that offends our rights, takes away what is properly ours, like our tomatoes. We get angry. And yet, the letter to the Ephesians encourages us not to let that anger fester in us. Not to make room for the devil, as Ephesians says. Not to get mired in bitterness, quarreling, and strife as a result of the offense that we've taken. Rather, to be humane, to be forgiving, patient, to show kindness, to seek reconciliation. And after all, says Ephesians, we are members of one another. We are members of one another. Quite a profound way of looking at the world, isn't it? Think that all of us together are members of a single body, that all of us depend on each other, that none of us exists in isolation, but that we actually belong together. We have been placed in relationship to each other for a good reason. And I think it's pretty easy for us to affirm that this is true, depending on where we draw the circle that marks the outer perimeter of that belonging. Yes, here at Trinity Church, Ashland, we are all members of one another, and we owe each other humane treatment and kindness and understanding. But those people over there are another story. Or we in the United States of America are members of one another. But those people outside the circle of our belonging are not deserving of humane treatment. They are not us. This is a constant temptation for us, or else the author of the letter of Ephesians would not have gone to such great lengths to point out this temptation that we continually face, or to remind us that to be children of God, to be imitators of God, to be holy as God is holy, is to walk in love. The kind of love that Christ manifested, the kind of love that is willing to offer oneself, not only to one's friends, but even to one's enemies. To offer kindness and understanding even to those who are prepared to inflict violence and harm upon us, because they view us as outside the circle of their belonging. Our gospel lesson today includes dangerous language that is suggestive of this possibility of excluding some people and including others. So when it talks about these Jews who were grumbling with one another at what Jesus said about being the bread that came down from heaven, it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge the way that kind of language has been turned throughout history to exclude and even to demonize and to justify violence against those who are outside the circle of our belonging. Now, whether Jews is really an appropriate translation of the original here is open to debate. Literally, what that word says is Judeans. And if you read the Gospel of John carefully and see how Jesus is continually moving back and forth between Galilee and Samaria and Judea, it may have something to do with kind of regional antipathies and Jesus' criticism of the ruling elite in Jerusalem, in Judea, and the temple institution and the way that it was established that was exploitative and domineering over other Jews. Nevertheless, when we hear that all who believe in me shall have eternal life, we do have to ask ourselves, we can't help but ask, but what about those who do not believe? Are they excluded somehow from this great mission of Christ? This bread that he represents, bread of the Spirit, bread of God's love for the whole world. It was so great that he was willing to give his only Son to the end, that all that believe in him should not perish, but have eternal life. And we, perhaps like those Judeans in the gospel story, are tempted to try to grasp this gift with the sort of knowledge that they display, this kind of literal understanding. Well, if he is come down from heaven, then how can he be, as we know, also the son of Joseph and his father and his mother? How can he be this human being from Nazareth of Galilee and at the same time say that he came down from heaven? And use this kind of discriminating intellect as a way to hold Christ at a distance and judge for ourselves whether this bread is for us and only for us, or if there are some for whom it is not given. The gospel John appeals to our capacity to go beyond what we can understand intellectually. Indeed, while the symbolism of the Exodus underlies this 6th chapter of John that we've been dwelling on for the last several weeks, this feeding in the wilderness and this crossing of the sea by night, this manna that comes down from heaven. There is, I think, also a deeper, perhaps more deeply buried symbolism in this chapter of John that harkens back to another story in the Old Testament. It's the story that we find in the early chapters of Genesis, where we find a food in the garden that leads to knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent seeking to deceive our father and mother, Adam and Eve, promises that if we eat of this tree of knowledge, that our eyes will be opened and we will be like God, and we will not die. Of course, we all know what happened. They ate of that fruit and they acquired the knowledge of good and evil, and with it they also took upon themselves the power of death and fell under its sway. We also find in the same story another tree, a tree of life, a tree whose fruit gives life, a bread that comes down from heaven to nourish the world with life, the very life of God. And it is this fruit, this bread, the tree of life, that Christ has come to bestow on the world as a gift that we can only apprehend by faith, by trusting him, by opening ourselves to the love of God through whom this gift comes, continually poured out for us, as it was in the very creation of the world. And how we know this gift that embraces not only us, but the whole world in its circle of belonging. This bread of life. We know it in the body of Jesus. A human body, a vulnerable and frail and mortal body. One subject to the same insults, and injuries, and dangers, and sufferings as our own. And yet does not lash out in fear, does not draw a little circle and say, I'm only responsible for those who lie inside my circle, but continually moves outward in love to nourish the world with the gift of God's love, even those who reject the gift, even those who put God outside their circle of belonging.